The brick shattered my window at 2:17 a.m. Rain lashed my face as I lunged into the darkness, my wife's scream still ringing in my ears. The hooded figure in the mud wasn't a stranger. He was security, hired by my own parents. I'm holding a folder that proves the woman I feared was watching me. Was actually paid to live across the street my entire life. The real question isn't who's lying. It's why. My hands shake as I flip through the redacted pages. Every memory I trusted is a contract clause. And the people who raised me? They're the ones who signed it. The smell of stale coffee and unwashed wool clung to the attic's rafters. David Miller pressed his forehead against the chilled glass, the rhythmic pulse of his own blood thrumming in his ears. Below, across the rain-slicked asphalt of the cul-de-sac, Eleanor Vance's porch light flickered. She stepped out, her movements fluid and practiced as she retrieved a wicker mail basket. 48 hours of vigil had etched a dull ache into David's lower spine. He ignored the twitch in his thigh, focusing instead on the way Eleanor's fingers lingered on a blue envelope. The DNA report sat on his desk, a single sheet of paper that stripped the Miller name from his bones. It transformed his childhood memories into a collection of borrowed artifacts. The data was cold, undeniable. It stated a 0% biological match to Robert and Susan Miller. The ink was dry, but the implications were still bleeding. He reached for his binoculars, the cold metal casing biting into his palms. Through the lenses, Eleanor's face jumped into sharp relief. The fine webbing of wrinkles around her eyes, the silver hair tucked behind a small, translucent ear. She looked like a grandmother from a storybook, not a woman who held the ledger of his true cost. Why did she watch him? Every time he left for the university to teach his history lectures, she was there, a shadow behind the lace curtains. Now, knowing he wasn't who he thought he was, her presence felt less like a neighborly quirk and more like a structural necessity of his prison. The floorboard groaned as David shifted his weight. A car door slammed down the street, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped space. Eleanor paused. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping upward toward his darkened window. David froze, breath hitching in his throat. For a heartbeat, the distance between them vanished. She didn't wave or shout. She simply stood there, clutching the mail, a silent guardian of a secret bought and paid for 30 years ago. He lowered the binoculars, the silence of the attic suddenly suffocating. He needed to move, to breathe, but the stairs beckoned with their own ritual. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted them under his breath, the wood smooth under his socks, reaching 12 at the landing, grounding himself, verifying the world. The peace of the house shattered with a violent, crystalline explosion. From the floor below, the sound of breaking glass tore through the quiet evening like a physical blow. David bolted down the remaining stairs, 13, 14, 15, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the living room just as a second impact thudded against the hardwood. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her hands pressed to her cheeks, her eyes wide and reflecting the jagged remains of the front window. Rain sprayed through the jagged hole, smelling of wet pavement and ozone. At her feet lay a heavy red brick, surrounded by a glittering sea of shards that looked like spilled diamonds in the lamplight. "David," she gasped, her voice trembling. It came out of nowhere. David didn't stop to comfort her, a choice that tasted like copper in his mouth. He lunged for the front door, the brass handle cold and unforgiving. He flung it open, the humid night air rushing in to meet him. On the lawn, a dark shape moved near the high boxwood hedge. A hooded figure, obscured by the torrential downpour, turned to run. "Hey!" David bellowed, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate edge. He leapt off the porch, his dress shoes skidding on the slick grass. The figure was fast, weaving through the shadows of the perfectly manicured oaks that lined the street. David pushed his legs harder, the ache in his spine forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He tracked the movement of the dark fabric, the rhythmic splash of boots in puddles. This wasn't just a prank. In Oak Ridge, windows didn't break. In Oak Ridge, the world was supposed to be silent and suburban. The chase led them into the narrow, muddy alleyway that ran behind the properties of Elm Street. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves rose up to meet them. The hooded figure tripped on a protruding root, sprawling face forward into the muck. David didn't hesitate. He dived, his weight carrying them both deeper into the mire. The struggle was visceral and loud. David felt the rough texture of a technical jacket under his fingers, the heat of another man's breath against his neck. The assailant fought with a disciplined intensity, striking out with short, calculated blows that suggested training rather than panic. A fist caught David in the jaw, sending a flash of white light through his vision and the salty taste of blood into his mouth. He roared, pinning the man's wrists into the mud. With a heave of effort, David yanked the hood back. The man beneath was in his late 20s, with a buzz cut and a clinical, detached expression that didn't flicker even as he was caught. He wasn't a local kid. He was a professional. David's eyes drifted to the man's belt, where a heavy black device, a long-range microphone, was clipped next to a high-end camera lens. "Who are you?" David hissed, his fingers digging into the man's shoulders. "Who sent you?" The man remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point over David's shoulder. David reached into the man's open jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against a stiff, plastic-coated folder. He ripped it out, the movement sharp and jagged. Subverted, beat 1.4, David stood up, his chest heaving, the heavy folder clutched in his shaking, mud-streaked hand. The security guard didn't move to reclaim it. He simply rolled onto his side, watching David with a chilling, patient stillness. David wiped a smear of grit from his eyes and flipped the folder open. He expected to find a private investigator's license, perhaps a name of a rival at the university, or even a local thief's scouting notes. The logic was sound. Someone was stalking him, and catching the stalker would reveal the threat. He felt a surge of triumph, a rare moment of clarity. He had the evidence. He had won the physical confrontation. He imagined taking this to the police, showing them the surveillance equipment, and finally ending the paranoia that had gripped his life since the DNA test arrived. He looked at the first page, his heart slowing to a steady, confident thrum. The document inside was a contract. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper, the kind his father always used for high-level acquisitions. At the top, the letterhead of Miller Holdings stared back at him. David's breath hitched. His eyes scanned the lines, skipping over the legalese to the names at the bottom. The signatures were unmistakable. Robert Miller, Susan Miller, and across from them, in a shaky, elegant script, Eleanor Vance. The triumph died in his throat, replaced by a cold, leaden weight. This wasn't a file on a criminal. It was a payroll ledger. The contract detailed a monthly residential stipend paid to Eleanor Vance for the past 30 years. The terms were explicit. She was to maintain a continuous presence at the Elm Street property, provide weekly observation logs to the Millers, and ensure that Subject D remained within the established neighborhood perimeter. The guard finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You weren't supposed to see that, David. Your father just wanted to keep the perimeter tight." The world tilted. The ghost across the street wasn't a predator stalking an innocent man. She was an employee. She was a paid observer, a human camera installed by the people who tucked him in at night. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. His parents hadn't just lied about his blood. They had built a laboratory and called it a childhood. He looked back at his house, where the warm yellow light spilled out of the broken window. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a cage with the door left ajar. He had sought the truth to find his freedom, but all he had found was the receipt for his own captivity. He was in a worse position than he had been 10 minutes ago. Now, he knew the enemy wasn't outside the gates. The enemy was the one who had built them. David didn't wait for the guard to get up. He turned and ran, not away from the danger, but toward the source of the rot. He counted the steps back to his street, 42, 43, 44. The numbers of frantic prayer against the rising tide of nausea. He burst through the heavy oak doors of his parents' estate in Oak Ridge, the smell of expensive furniture polish and filtered air hitting him like a wall. He didn't stop to take off his muddy shoes, leaving dark, smeared footprints across the white marble foyer. "Robert! Susan!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He found them in the study, a room lined with books that had never been read, and a fireplace that glowed with a perfect, gas-fed flame. Robert sat behind a desk of carved mahogany, tapping a gold pen against the blotter. Tap, tap, tap. Susan stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the dark glass. "David," Robert said, his voice smooth and devoid of surprise. "You're tracking mud on the Persian. It's unsightly." David slammed the folder onto the desk, the mud from his hands staining the wood. 30 years. You've been paying the woman across the street to watch me for 30 years? What is I? A project? A science experiment? Susan turned, her face a mask of practiced empathy. She didn't move toward him. She stayed in her designated space. "We were protecting you, David. You've always had tendencies toward wandering. We needed to ensure your safety." "Safety?" David laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You hired thugs to throw bricks through my window. You've turned my life into a Truman Show nightmare." Robert stood up, adjusting his cuffs so they met his wrists with surgical precision. "We didn't hire anyone to throw bricks. That was likely a lapse in Michael's judgment, a distraction to keep you inside. But the drama is irrelevant now. The situation has changed." He leaned forward, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier. "Eleanor Vance is dying, David. Congestive heart failure. The doctors give her weeks, perhaps days. When she passes, the contract expires. The house, the records, the entire arrangement reverts to the holding company. We are merely managing the transition." "Managing the transition," David whispered. He looked at his mother, searching for a flicker of guilt, a hint of the woman who used to bake him birthday cakes. He saw only a recording device in her hand, the small red light glowing as she documented his agitation. He backed away, the sterile scent of the room choking him. He needed to get to Eleanor. If she was dying, she was the only one left who might have a conscience. He turned and bolted for the door, ignoring Robert's command to sit down and behave like a miller. He reached his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine only gave a hollow, metallic click. He looked out the window. All 4 tires were shredded, the rubber hanging in ribbons against the asphalt. He looked up at the hedge, and there, nestled in the branches of a decorative birdhouse, a small glass lens glinted in the moonlight. He wasn't going anywhere. The walk back to Elm Street felt like a march through a graveyard. Every house he passed was a replica of the last. Eggshell white, perfectly trimmed, silent. But now, David saw the wrong details. There were no bicycles left on porches, no stray balls in the yards. The neighborhood was a stage set, and the actors were all behind their curtains. As he reached the edge of Eleanor's property, a pair of headlights cut through the dark. A white SUV with "Neighborhood Watch" decaled on the side pulled across his path, the tires crunching on the gravel. Two men stepped out. They wore tan uniforms that mimicked police gear, their belts heavy with batons and radios. "Evening, Mr. Miller," one of them said. It was James Wilson, a man David had seen at every 4th of July barbecue for a decade. "A bit late for a stroll, isn't it?" "Get out of my way, James," David said, his voice low. "I'm going to see Eleanor." "Can't let you do that," James replied, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "Orders from the main office. You're looking a bit unwell. Maybe you should go home and sleep it off, right?" David tried to push past him, but James's hand caught his chest, a solid wall of muscle. "I said, you're going home, aren't you?" David swung. It was a desperate, clumsy punch that landed on James's shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous. The second guard lunged, his baton sliding from its holster with a terrifying shink. The first blow caught David in the ribs, knocking the air from his lungs in a wheezing burst. He fell to his knees, the cold gravel biting into his skin. The second blow hit his shoulder, a white-hot spike of pain that radiated down to his fingertips. "You think you're special, don't you?" James hissed, leaning over him. "You think the rules don't apply to you because of your last name? You're just a line item, David. Go home." They left him there in the dirt, the SUV idling as they watched him crawl back toward his own driveway. David's vision blurred. He looked up at his neighbors' houses. In every window, a silhouette stood. The Johnsons, the Smiths, the Miller's friends. None of them moved. None of them called the police. He saw a flash of white in the gutter, a discarded envelope. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and pulled it toward him. It was a check, a beautification grant for $5,000, issued by Miller Holdings. It was dated yesterday. He looked down the street, the realization washing over him like ice water. It wasn't just Eleanor. It was everyone. The entire block was on the payroll. His friends, his family friends, were all paid wardens in a suburban panopticon. He was the only person on Elm Street who wasn't getting a check. The next morning, the sun rose over Oak Ridge with a mocking brilliance. David sat at his kitchen table, his arm in a makeshift sling, watching Sarah pace the floor. She had been crying for hours, her eyes rimmed with red. "They threatened my job, David," she whispered, staring at her phone. The senior partner called. He said there's been an inquiry into my billable hours. He said if I don't get you under control, I'm out. How do they have that much power? They don't have power, Sarah, David said, his voice hollow. They have a ledger. Everything in this town is a transaction. He looked out the window at Eleanor's house. The Victorian looked grayer today, as if the life were truly leaching out of its walls. Then he saw it. A rhythmic pulse of light from the second-story window. Short, short, long. Short, short, long. It was a signal. A distress code they had discussed in a history lecture years ago, something from the French Resistance. Eleanor was calling him. I have to go, David said, standing up. They'll kill you, Sarah cried, grabbing his hand. They can't kill me, David replied, looking at his own reflection in the darkened screen of his laptop. I'm their primary asset. You don't destroy the hardware until you've backed up the data. He waited for the storm. It came at midnight, A violent Midwestern deluge that turned the world into a blur of gray and silver. The guards in the SUV had their windows rolled up, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the sheets of rain. David slipped out the back door, staying low to the ground. He didn't count the steps this time. He moved by instinct, a shadow among shadows. He reached the side of the Vance mansion, his fingers finding the familiar rough stone of the foundation. He found a cellar window, the wood rotted and soft. He kicked it in, the sound drowned out by a peal of thunder. The air inside the basement smelled of wet limestone and ancient mold. It was cold, the kind of cold that lived in the bones of the earth. David climbed through, his boots hitting the dirt floor with a muffled thud. He moved toward the stairs, his hand grazing a rusted crate. He reached the foyer, the grand space illuminated by flashes of lightning. The chandelier above him swayed in the draft, its crystal prisms chiming like tiny, mournful bells. "David." The voice came from the darkness of the library. A man stepped out, his posture military straight, his Velcro watch strap making a sharp rip snap as he tightened it. Michael Davis. The fixer. "You should have stayed in bed, kid," Michael said. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He moved with the grace of a predator, closing the distance in 3 long strides. David swung a heavy brass fire poker he had snatched from the hearth. Michael ducked, the metal whistling over his head, and countered with a palm strike to David's chest that sent him reeling back against the grand staircase. "Your father wants you home," Michael said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's worried about your mental state." David scrambled up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Michael followed, his boots heavy on the wood. At the landing, David saw the rope, the thick, velvet-covered cord that held the massive chandelier in place. It was anchored to a heavy brass cleat on the wall. As Michael lunged, David didn't fight. He dived for the cleat. He jammed the poker into the mechanism, the metal screaming as it sheared the pin. The sound was like a mountain cracking open. The rope whipped through the air, the friction smelling of burnt hemp. The chandelier, 200 pounds of leaded crystal and brass, plummeted. It hit Michael squarely, a chaotic explosion of glass and light. The fixer disappeared beneath a pile of shimmering shards. David didn't look back. He ran for the master bedroom. Subverted beat 3.4. He burst through the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The room smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Eleanor Vance lay in a massive 4-poster bed, her skin the color of parchment, her breathing a shallow, wet rattle. In her hand, she clutched a leather-bound ledger, its edges worn and stained. David rushed to her side, his knees hitting the floorboards. "Eleanor, I'm here. I saw the signal." She looked at him, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but burning with a sudden, sharp lucidity. "David," she whispered, "the boy who counts." She pushed the ledger into his hands. "Take it. It's all there. The original entries. The ones they couldn't redact." David felt a surge of hope so strong it made him dizzy. This was it. The unredacted contract, the proof of the surveillance, the illegal holding companies, the evidence he needed to bring the whole structure down. He imagined the look on Robert's face when the FBI knocked on the door. He felt a moment of profound relief. He had reached the source. He had the truth. He was the hero of his own story. "Thank you," he breathed, opening the book. "We're going to get you help. We're going to end this." He looked at the first page, expecting to see a list of payments or a corporate charter. Instead, he saw a birth certificate. Not his. A different name. Robert Miller, Jr. And beneath it, a handwritten note in Eleanor's script dated 30 years ago. Received, 1 male infant. Condition, healthy. Payment, debt settled in full. Total, $250,000. David's hands began to shake. He flipped the page. There were photos. A young Eleanor, standing in a cramped apartment, holding a baby. The baby had David's eyes. But the apartment wasn't in Oak Ridge. It was a tenement in the city. "Eleanor?" David asked, his voice a thin, fragile thread. "What is this?" She coughed, a spray of red dotting her white nightgown. "I wasn't your neighbor, David. I was your mother's landlord. She was 19. She had nothing. And I had a husband who liked the horses too much. I owed Robert Miller more than I could ever pay." The truth hit him like a physical blow, more devastating than any baton. "You sold me?" "I didn't just sell you," she wheezed, her eyes filling with tears. "I sold the lie. Robert's son, the real Robert Jr., he died. An accident in the pool. Robert couldn't have the scandal. He couldn't have the loss. So he bought a replacement. He bought you to fill the hole in the floorboards." David looked at the ledger, the numbers blurred by the sudden, hot sting of tears. He wasn't a victim of a surveillance project. He was a body double. He was a living cover-up for a death that had been erased from history. His entire existence was a blood money transaction designed to protect a man's reputation. He looked at the window. The police lights were already there, blue and red strobes reflecting off the rain-streaked glass. "David Miller!" A voice boomed from a bullhorn outside. "This is the Oak Ridge Police. We know you're in there. Release the hostage and come out with your hands up." He was trapped. He wasn't the whistleblower. He was the intruder. He wasn't the son. He was the evidence. Robert hadn't just bought his childhood. He had bought the law. David stood in the center of the room, clutching the ledger that proved he didn't exist, while the world outside prepared to erase him again. The hope he had felt moments ago was gone, replaced by the crushing realization that he had no name, no home, and no way out. "David," Eleanor whispered, her hand reaching for his. "The cellar, the tunnels. Before the town was a prison, it was a port." She slumped back, the rattle in her chest falling silent. David stood alone in the flickering blue light. He took the ledger and the birth certificate, stuffing them into his jacket. He didn't look at her again. He ran, not to the stairs, but back to the basement. He remembered his history, the Prohibition-era tunnels that ran from the old mansions to the river. He found the hidden door behind a rack of empty wine bottles, the stone cold and damp. He crawled through the darkness, the smell of wet earth filling his lungs. He counted the seconds, the minutes, the feet. He emerged a mile away, in the tall grass behind the community center where the annual charity gala was in full swing. He could hear the music, a string quartet playing something light and expensive. He could see the silhouettes of the town's elite through the high windows, their champagne glasses glinting like jewels. David didn't wipe the mud from his face. He walked through the service entrance, past the waiters in their identical silicone masks. He reached the projection booth, the air smelling of hot dust and electricity. He didn't use a gun. He didn't scream. He simply took the scanned images of the purchase contract and the death certificate of the real Robert Miller Jr. and fed them into the gala's digital projector. The ballroom went silent. The music died in a discordant screech of violins. On the massive screen above the stage, the image of his own price tag flickered for everyone to see. Robert and Susan stood in the front row, their faces turning the color of ash. David watched from the shadows of the balcony. He saw the masks of the neighbors begin to slip. He saw the confusion, the dawning horror, and the frantic whispering. The prison walls hadn't fallen, but the lights had been turned on. 2 days later, David sat in a small, greasy diner on the edge of the state line. Sarah sat across from him, her laptop open. "I found the holding company, David," she said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. It wasn't just the neighborhood. It was a network of shell corporations used to fund private security and hush payments across 3 counties. The Millers didn't just own a street. They owned a system. David looked at his hands. They were clean now, but he could still feel the grit of the alleyway under his nails. "It's over, Sarah. We're leaving." "Where?" "Chicago," David said, looking at the road ahead. "Somewhere with enough people that nobody has time to watch the neighbors." The apartment in Chicago was small, the walls thin enough to hear the rhythmic thrum of the L train passing overhead. It was loud, chaotic, and completely anonymous. David stood by the window, watching the sea of people below. No one looked up. No one was counting his steps. He reached for the blinds, the plastic slats cool under his fingers. He pulled the cord, the room plunging into a soft, private shadow. For the first time in 32 years, David Miller wasn't a project. He wasn't a replacement. He was just a man in a room, and that was enough. The end.